weapon was far too large to rightfully be called a sword. It was larger, thicker, heavier, and cruder than any normal blade. By all accounts, it was no more than a hulking mass of iron.
Hello, everybody out there in the tabletop playing world, the universe, the places that you are. I have no idea. From parts unknown.
No.
Oh my God. From parts unknown. It is I, the void, the darkness, the last thing you ever want to see, the lich that lives under the stairs. It is I, Brill, who is with, of course, the human fighter that is playing to slay me, Doc.
Yep, and over to my right here, I've got Joe Rogan, but he's wound up in duct tape and his mic's not working, so we're just going to ignore him for now.
Hold up, Jamie. That's actually a fun fact for our listeners. Every episode of DumpStat actually has featuring Joe Rogan on it. He's just tied up. We can't help it. So today, in a full jumping the shark move, we are, episode 3-4 into this podcast?
That's right.
We're already there. We thought it would be fun to talk about what stat you should dump, as that's the episode.
What
the podcast is DumpStat. I actually been thinking about this a little bit, kind of going back and forth on what stats for a Dungeons and Dragons character that I always keep on, that are just for some reason my go-to things I want for a character, no matter what class, race, creed, whatever they might be. And I realized actually, and I think this is more of a 3.5 leftover in me, that no matter what, I for some reason am one of those people that looks at the wisdom stat and I'm like,
my God, you're not serious right now.
That needs to be something that I need to chuck in no matter what.
That is honestly, like, I mean, we didn't plan this conversation at all, ladies and gentlemen, but let me tell you, I was going to say the same thing with wisdom, right, because my go-to is usually wisdom as well, for getting the dump on.
Well, I can say with certainty that the wisdom stat, for some reason for me, in both editions that I've really played in, has been, I don't know, it's been something that I really have needed in games, whether that's its connection to the perception stat in 5e, or the fact that the basic skill set you get with a good wisdom stat for any character seems to be just a smart move across the board.
Yep.
So wisdom is the thing that isn't my dump stat. If anything, it seems to be a major priority.
I see where you're going now.
Yeah, but if I was, but the thing that I was going to dump, like always dump, unless it's a bard, I'm looking at you, charisma. I, for some reason, have never looked at charisma as a serious stat, really. And I know some of you who like to persuade or intimidate as a skill set. I think you guys are interesting, and I have certainly had good charisma stats in the past for certain characters. However, I don't care if my guy's ugly. I kind of don't care if they're all that charming sometimes. Charisma is just one of those things that I'm more than willing to go, yeah. Actually, you know what? We're going to work backwards a little bit. We should mention what the stats are.
Sure.
So, Doc, list off all the stats for D&D.
Yeah. So in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, if you don't already know, there are 6 main stats that you can have. The first one is strength. The second one is dexterity. And then the third is constitution. These mainly have to do with how sculpted your body is, how able you are to deal with situations on a physical level. Strength is more like brute force, just moving and shoving things, wrestler style. Joe Rogan's nodding his head. Dexterity is your ability to kind of outmaneuver, outjump, weasel your way out of situations. And constitution is literally your health. That's kind of the main thing that it's good for, and also staving off poison. But it directly ties into how your health plays out. Then you have kind of the more, should I say, mental and verbal kind of components, where you have intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Intelligence is how book smart you are. Wisdom is how street smart you are and how kind of intuitive you are with the information that's around you. Charisma is how good you are at exuding a powerful personality, persuading people, stuff like that. So those are the 6 main stats. And what we mean by DumpStat is when you're making a character, you're going to have some high stats and you're going to have some low stats. And your low stats are going to be weaknesses that your character has. And it's always a debate of, well, what's that weakness going to be? And it's always kind of a debate. And some people have go-to dump stats and some people don't. And some people like to mix it up. So that's what we're talking about here. Mike, it sounds like that you pretty clearly want to drop charisma. I can say for myself that that's accurate for your personality. Oh, got him.
Oh, got him. I actually, though, to help paint this picture better, I want to help people with something that might be a little difficult maybe to understand when it comes to the stats.
Yeah.
I know that famously other D&D, I don't know, meme lords have done something similar to this with like apples or oranges or tomatoes or something like that. I'm going to do it with Joe Rogan right now.
Okay.
So strength is basically how can you manhandle Joe Rogan. Dexterity is how fast you can kind of maneuver around Joe Rogan, I assume, in jiu-jitsu.
Mm-hmm.
Constitution is if you can beat Joe Rogan in a drinking game, honestly. Or you both drop DMT, and who can process it better by their liver? Then you have charisma. Which one of you is better at stand-up? Then you inevitably have wisdom. Which one of you knows not to get which kind of pot from where? And finally, you have intelligence. Which one of you can tell Jamie through the clearest amount of words and with the best intent to pull it up, Jamie? These are the stats through Joe Rogan. I feel like I botched it a little bit, but there you go.
I mean, we got there.
We did get there.
Joe Rogan is nodding his head furiously, so he definitely agrees with us.
I'm worried that down this podcast, I'm going to have to do a Joe Rogan impression, and I'm going to fail.
Well, really, the ultimate goal for us is to get on with Joe Rogan, and then for Joe Rogan to get on with us. So,
Jesus Christ, if he's saying his name, does he appear?
Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan.
Or is this a drinking game, and did someone just die? So there's some guy at home just going like, stop it, stop it. So when it actually comes to, you know what, now that I'm thinking about it, I do drop charisma quite a bit as a dumb stat. Mm-hmm. I have also in the past, just especially if they're not a rogue or maybe some kind of fighter that uses it well, I've kind of just dropped dexterity usually because, again, when you're rolling your stats, which you do roll your stats or you pick from that point system that's evil, but you do roll your stats. The dice can be rather abusive in what they're doing. Yep. So sometimes you'll get stats that are fine, normalish. Never trust the guy that rolled his stats in private and they're all 18s. He's a special sort. I've known many people to be like, well, I rolled these stats in the dark at my house. Turns out perfect rolls across the board. And you're like, what statistically is the odds of that? And they're like, 2 billion to 1. And you're like, well, I don't think I believe you. Right. You're going to get things that you're going to have to dump. Dexterity for me, I've been willing to be like, well, maybe my character's a fat ass or is just slow. I've been willing to cop that on the chin times. Yeah. And also, unless you're a stealth character or you're some kind of character that's known for their track and field, I've never really seen dexterity help me too much. Sometimes, but not too much.
Well, that's interesting because, speaking on a practical level, a lot of traps, a lot of spells at lower level tend to use dexterity quite a bit. And for any character that is like a rogue or a warlock or anything that uses even like barbarians, you're going to be using dexterity as a stat that directly helps you avoid damage because of your armor and also because of dexterity saving throws. Some people on Reddit will tell you that dexterity is kind of the god stat because it helps with initiative, it helps with all these other things. And so like frankly, like if you're new to Dungeons and Dragons, dexterity is probably one that you don't want to drop.
You don't want to be like me. I agree that dexterity, especially in those early levels, is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason as to why, and I think part of this boils down to my personality as a player and a character builder. I've always looked at constitution as highly important, wisdom, highly important, kind of at the end of the day, a middling to good strength stat to really kind of carry me. And again, a lot of this is kind of holdover from earlier editions. Constitution's one of those things that is your HP, whether you're a wizard or not. It can be extremely helpful for what happens later on. I had a DM that tried to poison us every week.
Well, did you actually drink the Gatorade then, or?
I mean, it doesn't always have to be through Gatorade. Sometimes there's poison darts that come out of the floor. Sometimes every enemy decided to coat their weapons in the blood of the most poisonous dart frog they could find. Like, I had a DM who was just all day, every day trying to exhaust, poison, like. It was all things that kind of fell into that Constitution realm. And I know not everybody thinks about Constitution the same way I do.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I kind of was willing, kind of weirdly enough, in the same way where I accepted the DumpStat as dexterity for a little bit, to just cop getting caught into a poisonous trap. Because I'm like, okay, I'll fall into the poisonous trap, but I think I'll be okay.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, it was a weird give and take. And that's an important thing to remind yourself when you're playing and making your character. Make your character in such a way that you can live through the meta, but you're not harming what you're creating. So I've known people that have made stats for their character that have been almost completely 100% not really what that character would be like, right? I had this one guy who made a great character on the meta. However, RP wise, his stats were very strange. He wanted to play a character that was very, very intelligent, but also kind of had the perfect body. Problem is, you really can't have that when you're rolling stats.
Yep.
Something's gonna budge. So his dump stat ended up being intelligence.
Yeah, here it goes. Here we go.
Right. So it started to really kind of hurt him because he'd present himself as this very intelligent kind of wizard fighter. And he'd just kind of waltz in and be like, I've done it all. And kind of have that very adventuring vibe. And then he would talk this big game, and then we would like hit a puzzle, or we'd hit some rolls where the character would have to make intelligence checks or something along those lines.
You found a mind player.
Right, yeah, and he would just kind of come apart at the seams. So you kind of have to, when you're creating that character, have an idea of what you want prior. I know power gamers are always going to be there, but really, for your own RP, if you want to make a character that, let's say, is a drunk, right? Because I know a lot of people that do the drunk thing, and they're like, I'm a drunk, I hang out in bars, I'm an adventurer, but I drink, or something like that. And a high constitution, maybe a little bit of charisma, not the best dexterity, and probably a lot of like wisdom, kind of, as you put it, street smarts, Joe Rogan smart, you might say, I think are some good things to kind of consider along with whatever your class is. Because again, if you're a drunk, but you're also like a road super dex character, I'm going to kind of look at you like, interesting. Did you just sober up for those 10 minutes? No, I'm fast when I'm drunk. And I'm like, oh, well, then maybe work with your DM to like maybe have you give you a disadvantage when you're sober or something like that. Something fun that you can affect the game in a meta way through role playing.
Yeah.
That's just an idea of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. And, while we're kind of talking about it, I think you mentioned like intelligence, right, as a DumpStat being used. I have more to say on this, but I know that intelligence gets put on the butcher block, frankly. It's one of those stats where it's not going to be useful in every game, and until you're at higher levels, you're not really going to be encountering it in saving throws and different things. You may start encountering it kind of around level 4, level 5, but before then, it's just not going to be something that you run into quite a bit. But intelligence, when people tend to dump intelligence and wisdom, they usually tell me, or they usually say like, oh, well, I have an intelligence of, 10 and a wisdom of 12. And so I'm a literal idiot. And I just have like bad test scores. And, I just like go out and I just fall down for no reason because I'm just a bumbling blub of lubber. And I'm like, that's not how it works. Because if you look at like the basic stats of something like a commoner, I think a commoner, and I'm going to double check this real quick, but a commoner will have stats that are, and I'm actually pulling it up right now. So a commoner has 10 across the board: 10 strength, 10 dex, 10 intelligence, 10 wisdom.
Yeah, an average person.
Right. An average person has, 10 in intelligence and wisdom. And even then, having an 8 in something means that like you're probably still going to approach something with as an average person would. So sure, maybe your intelligence is 8, and that doesn't mean that you are a literal bumbling idiot. It just means, well, maybe you haven't hit the books very much. Like, you can still put 1 and 1 together when you need to, but it doesn't mean that you are just an absolute just null-minded person.
Average, calm down. It's not until you get into those real negative scores that, which by the way, your DM would probably want you to re-roll, frankly, if your DM is nice. But if you want to keep them fine, that kind of shit I would maybe take from like a guy who's like, hey, DM, I got a 5. And you're like, all right.
And it can be cool to have someone role playing someone who is literally an idiot, but I think it takes an awareness to do that. If you're doing your first or second character and you're trying to do that, it can be kind of hard to nail down the dynamic with your table playing an idiot, because quite frankly, you're going to frustrate the other players. You're going to frustrate the DM if you don't do it well.
Moreover, on that point, though, I do want to say this is a bit directed. I'm kind of looking at you, barbarians. I love all of you. Like, all of you are my people. I'm pretty sure the first, 10 characters I played in Dungeons & Dragons, especially 5e, were almost exclusively barbarians. If I have to make a character quickly, it's a barbarian. I get that class. We smack things. I enjoy it. You can do some really cool flair when you're actually killing something. I'm with you boys. I'm with the rage boys. Being dumb Conan the Barbarian can get old. Watch it. I know. I think that trap is going to fall a lot more barbarians than wizards.
Yep.
However, a stupid wizard that can't handle his spells does sound like a fun time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's definitely a unique time. I'm sorry. I just wanted to call a class out and maybe get some heat for it later.
Yeah, that's fair. Though I mean, that is a very good point, right? There kind of tends to be class stereotypes and in stats that you want to drop in each class and kind of what to do. And, here's the thing. I'm not super against tropes in your game. Like, I'm not one of these elitists that says, oh, well, you have to identify the tropes and get rid of them because that is the only way to play D&D. But, like, for me, it's just like, sometimes tropes can help guide your character. And, if you do want to play a dumped intelligence barbarian, that's probably one of the smarter things that you can do for that class. Just being frank here, because wisdom helps you, constitution helps you, strength helps you, dexterity helps you. Constitution, depends on what subclass you go into in barbarian. But what's the one stat you're really not going to be using as barbarian, Brill?
It's probably intelligence.
Yeah. So frankly, like, I get it. But I also get what you're saying with, like, hey, like, you don't have to be the stupid barbarian. And I think that's a good point to make.
And I mean, I pointed out only because your first character is going to be your favorite fantasy character. I'm sorry. I know everybody doesn't think this.
Rest in peace, Belmore.
Right. I thought you were unique. You thought you were unique. The first character you make in Dungeons and Dragons especially is going to be something that does say a lot about the first time you walk into a fantasy world and you're like, I can be Aragon or what have you. Or you could be like, I could be the character from Adventure Time, or I can't remember the characters from Adventure Time. Finn and Jake, there we go. Or you want to be a Joffrey type or something like that. You're probably just running through the list of fantasy icons and tropes a little bit. And that is fine. Again, my point to the dumb, stupid barbarians that listen to this podcast is it can get grating on other characters that always having the dumb guy there going, duh, especially if your kind of joke is very one note, because that's what a lot of it is for dumb characters. It is a bit of a yuck. Like, hey, I'm so dumb, I did this dumb thing. And everyone goes, okay. And you're like, isn't that quirky and funny? And they're like, it's kind of like the bard trying to fuck everything. Like, if done well, hilarious. If done poorly, it grades, Edgy warlocks. You're all that. Every warlock is kind of edgy. And that's fine again. However, done well, fantastic. Look at that cool guy in the corner of the bar, sipping his tea, talking to Cthulhu. Awesome. If done poorly, look at that guy in the corner of the bar, sipping his tea, talking to Cthulhu loudly. What? Like, there's a way to make the kind of thing fall short in a role-playing sense. I for one, kind of, when I look at that, I look at tropes as something that we're all going to use. They stuck around for a reason. I don't think they're bad, but I also think that you can't just crutch yourself on one, because if you do that too much and you ride it too much, not only do you become predictable, you can even become boring to yourself, which is tragic. I had one barbarian, and I think the reason why I'm going hard in the paint is because I've lived through this. I had one barbarian who was the definition of stupid when he started out. The definition of dumb. I basically wanted to do Conan the Barbarian and fuck anybody who stopped me. Right? My party tried to make me read. And eventually my DM was like, we gotta get you smart, man. Like, we just gotta get you smart. And I'm like, why? And they're like, the party is really tired of you murder hoboing and just being dumb and pissing in the street and making us get kicked out of every town we go to, man. Either we don't travel with you or we got to make you smart. So we literally had a side quest of looking for an elixir to fix this dummy, which became a great campaign. But part of it was my inexperience in playing and how I played at the time, right? I really turned it up to 11. I probably did some voices that were very unsavory, and I really made everyone go, oh Jesus, this it torpedoes everybody else in the party. It's selfish in a way to just be like, hey, this is my spotlight and I'm stupid. And my party was like, oh God, this is, and even me, like at session 3, I was like, this is actually exhausting to be this dumb.
Yeah.
So my DM almost like hucked a like mind flayer potion of you're the smartest man in the world now. Shut the fuck up and grow a personality. That was definitely the vibe everybody had.
Yeah.
But I will appreciate my DM for turning what could have been a game destroying moment because of me. I will hold to this, and it's why I feel strongly. Because of me and my immaturity, I think that my DM was very wise to be like, no, we're going to make this fun somehow for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make in that, like, your DumpStat does not necessarily have to dictate everything about how your character plays. I have a player right now who is running, it's actually really interesting, a rogue half barbarian who seduces her opponents, and she has a charisma of 11. So literally a +0 to their bonuses and things.
A very plain looking woman. Okay.
So,
interesting.
But here's the thing. She does a really good job role playing. So what she'll do is she'll approach guards and she will distract them. She'll kind of say, hey, how's it going? You come around here often? And, she'll go into the role-playing aspect of what you would normally do is like sexy bard. But she doesn't have that charisma bonus. But she's playing her character like the way that she wants to play, and she just doesn't have the bonuses necessarily to back it up. It just so happens that she gets really good rolls when she does this, and she just is pretty successful a lot of the time. And when she's not, she has like an 18 in dexterity, and she stabs the guards to death. But I think it's a really good example of, hey, one of her dump stats is actually charisma, even though that's something that her character relies on. It's not necessarily an innate ability for her, but she's able to still roleplay the character that she wants to play and play the game that she wants to play, even though the stats are not always in her favor. And I think it's fantastic. I love playing with that character just because I have to think on my feet and I have to kind of plan my sessions a little bit and like how to counteract a little bit besides just having guards posted everywhere. It's like, okay, well, maybe I should set up some traps. Maybe I should do this or that. But yeah, I think it's a really good point to make in that don't just let one dump stat dictate everything about your character. You have a load of other stats that you can rely on, and you can always play the character the way you want to play it. You just may not have the stats to back it up, which is okay. Like, I mean, talk to your DM about it, just make sure that's okay. But like,
I mean, as you said kind of before, and I think this is, I think, one of the best reasons why this podcast is called DumpStat. Drop your intelligence. Mm-hmm. I think the reason why I really ran with that title in that name is because I love the concept of being dumb and having flaws. Yeah. And it's okay to have a stat that can become a flaw and become something that really becomes intrinsic to a character. However, some dump stats that people say is like a terrible dump stat, like you said prior, aren't game breaking. To like, if you have 10, you're okay. Like you're gonna be all right. I know there are some power gamers who are like, if my stats aren't all above 15, then I don't know what I'm doing,
Yeah. And this is a good point to mention that 5th edition has been designed, I don't want to say to be easy, but it's been designed where you can still overcome despite having weaknesses. If you play AD&D and you go in and you don't have a rogue checking doors and checking for traps, you're dead, right?
Oh, yeah. I'm just going to say it, Doc. I kind of think 5e is built to be very user-friendly.
Oh, yeah.
I won't say easy. It's definitely made so that everybody can jump in.
Yep. And that was very purposeful design. I think that's honestly some of the reason why it's had so much success. But this isn't a business analytic podcast. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to DumpStat. Drop the intelligence today. No, I'm kidding. So, anyways, is that what business people sound like? I feel like it's not. It probably sounds more like a guy in his early 30s in like a boardroom recording a podcast on his company laptop.
I career-wise am so close to that. I have no idea what they sound like. I'm going to be one of them in a few years. I don't know what to do.
Gotta start a podcast.
I gotta do something. I'm in board meetings all the time, and I'm just sitting there. If you've ever seen the meme where it's like the alien walking around with a bunch of people, and it's like what it feels like to be high in public, that's me at my job all the time. Not high, but like feeling very strange. Like, okay, I hope everybody likes me. Oh no. But my anxiety and alarm aside.
So, Mike, I've got an idea of what we can do next. I think it would be good if we run through just some of the stats that we have, all the stats, and maybe suggest when and why you would want to make a stat your dump stat. If you roll an 8 or a 9 and you need to put a -1 somewhere, what's the reason why you'd put that into strength? Why would you put it to, intelligence? Why would you put it to constitution? Okay. But I think it might be a good idea if we do that. Does that sound good?
So if we're starting out with strength, when would you drop strength? If you're a wizard, if you are a magic user, a spell user, a mage of some kind, you will drop strength and maybe dexterity and perhaps constitution quite a bit because you are focusing on your mind, your brain, how smart you are. Wizards aren't known for CrossFit. They're known for books.
Yep.
And if you're a jacked wizard, dude, that's awesome. That's one of the coolest things I think I can think of. But you're not Jack Merlin most of the time. Most of the time, you're a frail old man with a pointy hat, and you're just looking around going, okay, time to master the universe. And you smack your stick around and do some magic hand movements and say the prayer that your mentor taught you. So that clerics, maybe. Clerics are a weird one, though. Clerics are one of those classes where you can make an argument like, we need all
clerics,
the stats.
You can literally.
Do you want to live? We need a cleric.
Yeah, and clerics are also like, you can kind of dip a cleric into anything. You can make a charisma cleric, you can make a sneaky cleric. We won't get into that. We should have an episode talking about all the different things clerics can do. But I agree with you with strength. Even with like, if you were to have a rogue, sometimes you should drop strength. Like a lot of times you're going to be relying all on dexterity for pretty much everything you're doing. But I've seen some rogues make some use out of strength, but it's not often. So
okay, this is going to be a weird little, I don't know, teaser for next episode. Next episode, the clerics you'll go or something.
Yeah, let's do it.
We are going to literally make a PSA next episode as to why the party needs a cleric.
Yep.
One of you needs to be a cleric.
Yep, let's do it.
I hate the rap that there is no cleric. Someone has to be a cleric, and there are cool ways to make a cleric.
Yes.
There's a reason why they're so versatile. It's because we need one. So, all right, so that would work with strength. Also, if you're a bard, I mean, unless you want the strength to, like, pin a dragon to bone, normally you're not gonna
right
like you're not gonna be jacked and singing a song. Again, if you are, congratulations, get swole, my dude.
So I think with that, like, we can look at dexterity next, which for me, I would suggest that, again, if you're a new player or if you're new to making characters or whatever, try not to drop dexterity. Just because it is going to be a stat at early levels that you use a lot. So even if it's not like, if you have a -1, try not to put it in dexterity, but if you're a little bit more familiar with the game, go ahead and do it. Like, go ahead and give it a try. It'll make your games a lot more interesting. I know my more veteran players that drop dexterity have a blast because they have these, penalties to being stealthy. They have penalties to initiative, and it causes some tension, which is cool.
Right. I do it, but I'm also a guy who's played a lot of D&D. I burped to know that. Ugh.
You're also a guy who named the podcast, DumpStat Drop the Intelligence. So,
yes, this is awesome. Don't be like me, new players. Don't be like me. I'm a lich that eats babies. You don't want to be like me. Be better than me.
Right. But yeah, so dexterity, if you're looking at like a fighter that's focused on strength, if you're looking at a martial class like even I wouldn't say paladins, it's one of those weird ones, but most paladins will not want dexterity.
I mean, I would say, and this is again, you can kind of do the vice versa when it comes to spellcasters versus, your melee classes. A wizard might not be the most dexterous, however, it's still a good idea. Mm-hmm. A druid might not be the most dexterous. It's probably still a good idea. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where no matter what, everybody, no matter where you go, who you are, you should still be able to outrun a monster. Yeah. That's never not a good idea. Yeah. You would always be able to go, what's that? A beholder? Let's get the fuck out of here. Yeah. That's still a good idea. Going away from dexterity, though, Constitution.
Ooh. This one's a good one.
Again, another stat that I enjoy, but also, mind you, I'm coming from that fighter barbarian world quite a bit. I would say that there needs to be a kind of a good reason to, if you're making your character and you're making, let's say, a sorcerer, right? And you're just tearing through. Oh, by the way, for dexterity, if you're a monk, take dexterity. My God.
That's right. Yeah.
My God. Don't be the slow monk. Why? Bad idea. If you're Bruce Lee, you're quick, my dude. So if you're like a sorcerer, let's say, I could fathom having a DumpStat that's Constitution. I get that for that and some of the other mage classes. Warlocks, wizards, druids, maybe to a certain extent. However, I do like a hardy druid. I do like a druid that can taste like poison on a toadstool and be like, yes, the fungi monster's 10 clicks north. I really like that in a druid. Maybe a ranger?
Yeah.
But
it's here's what I'm going to say about it, right? I think that Constitution is less risky to take the higher dice, health dice that you have. So Barbarian, which does play into their AC directly, so I wouldn't suggest, at least a minus in that. But Fighter, Ranger, Paladin, those classes that have the higher health dice, definitely less risky to give them a minus in Constitution, but it's one of those things where it's affecting your health and that affects everybody. So you have to be mindful of, are you giving yourself really good opportunities with your other stats if you take the minus in Constitution? Because sometimes that's what you need to do, right? If you want to be the fighter that has really good charisma, really good strength, a decent dexterity for rolling around, and you want them to have some basic knowledge recalling about the world, then okay, yeah, those are 4 of your 6 stats that you need to think of. So maybe you do drop Constitution and take the -1, and then you have just lower health, and more power to you if you decide to do that. I haven't really done that. But I usually
everybody else is scared about PP and HP.
Yep, exactly. And for me, I usually, if I'm doing anything, I'm putting a 0 to my constitution. I'm usually not making it a minus, but that's just me. If you want to challenge yourself, put a minus into constitution, get your other stats higher. I think that's usually the universal good way of making that the dump stat.
Which one next shall we do?
I would like to make a case for the defendant intelligence. So, yeah, the defendant would like to submit to the bench. No, I'm kidding. So here's the thing with intelligence. It's going to depend. Yes, when you look at the races, intelligence is the least used plus that's given out. Yes, when you're looking at classes, it is the least used stat that is going to be used as primary. The thing about intelligence is that the most frequently used skill in that is investigation. And quite often, players just use perception if they can't investigate. And also, if you can't recall information about it, your session's still going to go on. Your session's still going to get to the end. You may be like, oh, I didn't recall this thing, and now it's a surprise trap. Okay, but you're probably still going to live, and it's probably going to be okay. Here's the thing, though.
Right.
If your table has a DM who loves their lore, who loves making stuff up on the fly, who loves kind of the nitty gritty and kind of gets, a kick out of just getting players involved with that world building, right?
If you have a DM that's a bit full of himself and really plays up that God bit.
Yep. Then intelligence is going to help you a lot. It will help you a ton to have some points in intelligence. Maybe not a lot, right? Maybe, +2 or +1, but being able to say, hey, I'd like to know from my background if I know something about this, and you roll well and you get a +1 or a +2 with maybe a proficiency bonus, maybe not. And, maybe you can recall some information. And normally DMs love that stuff. They love it. And so that's it. That's my case for not dropping intelligence, right? Learn more about the world.
I'm going to call that the teacher's pet case. I mean, yeah, no, I agree. And I also think that no class is going to have a huge detriment to having a little education.
Yep.
Right. There's not going to be like a barbarian that's read a book once or twice isn't a bad idea.
No, it's not.
Having a paladin who is well read in his own scriptures is a good idea. Having a monk who's read the sacred tomes to learn the Iron Fist, to punch through the heart of the dragon in Shangri-La, like that's not a bad thing to have. Mm-hmm. Having a warlock being well studied in their patron, especially, these are ideas and concepts for lore, and or even having like a druid I think intelligence could even be maybe pushed as far as journaling. If you have a druid or a ranger who's traveled amongst the land and has essentially written a small tome about what they've seen, the mountains they've crossed, like these are not bad ideas for intelligence. Yeah. Education is never a bad idea, even in a fantasy world. Do I think it should be your prime stat all the time? Fuck no.
Right.
Do I think it needs to be dumped all the time? Also fuck no.
Right.
I agree with you. And of course, if you're a wizard, come on, guy, read a book.
Right.
Come on. Come on.
Yeah, you kind of need intelligence as a wizard. Well, I shouldn't say need, but I mean,
it's highly recommended.
It is extremely highly recommended. Yeah. It's kind of like what you said with monks. You can't really have a slow monk. You need a dexterous monk.
I have seen someone drop dex for monk. I've seen it. I think that's the reason why I had such a reaction to it. I'm like, don't be that train wreck. Yeah. I had one guy who made a monk who was basically we'll call him top half heavy. Like he's like, I want my punches to hurt.
Yeah.
And he made strength, and he didn't understand how the game works. So he basically just made a barbarian and a gi. And it was a very slow moving car wreck. One of the first encounters we had with a couple of orcs, it kind of went sideways really quick for him. Yeah. So not so much finesse on his part. Okay, moving down the list, let's look at wisdom. Or do you want to say it intelligence?
Well, I just wanted to say that, if you want to push because we talked about why you should keep intelligence. And, I think I would agree with you. If you want to increase your role-playing game, give yourself some intelligence stats, right? At least to recall information and use that in your role-playing. But as far as dumping it, yeah, it made sense. It makes sense. Like, it's going to be one of those things where, you don't need it. It's not going to be something that's crazy required for your game. And most classes aren't really going to utilize it. So I'm not going to judge you if you drop it.
Right. But it's kind of the thing, like, it's nice to have, but if you have to dump it because the dice say so, yeah.
Yeah, it is not a god stat, unfortunately. So yeah, like, go ahead and dump intelligence. It's okay. I won't judge you. I'll just be a little sad.
I'll just be sad that you can't recall my lore.
Right.
So wisdom. What are your thoughts on wisdom?
So this is the stat that I like to dump, as I said earlier in the podcast. And
I don't. Yeah, we disagree.
So here's the reason why. Everybody's going to have it. and I try to be the guy that doesn't. So, like, one of the things that I see at the table a lot is like, all right, somebody make a perception check. Who's proficient with perception? And, like, usually 75 to 100% of the players at the table, or 3 to 4 or 4 to 4 of the players, put up their hands because they're proficient in wisdom, and they, want to see things. They want to be able to make sure the person isn't lying. They want to make sure that all this other stuff. So I like to dump it because I like to not necessarily be inherently intuitive, right? I want to be able to look at the stuff that's in front of me and maybe investigate it with an intelligence stat. Yeah, so I try to rely on wisdom a little bit less than other players. But I also totally get it, right? Like, wisdom is a good stat. You're going to be able to see your environment. You're going to be able to make sure people aren't lying to you. It's also one of the more common, when you start moving from lower level spells to higher level spells, you're going to start seeing more wisdom checks for saving throws and things. So not a bad stat to take. Now, if you are going to dump it, you should be dumping it not for the sake that you're stupid, right? But you should be dumping it because there's other stats that you have that, need to take the primary. Maybe your other players that you're with are going to be strong in this area with wisdom, and you don't necessarily have to be. And things like martial classes, some spellcasters, I say some, like warlock and, sorcerer and wizards, they don't necessarily need that stat. So I would say, like, just be careful here if you're going to dump wisdom, but you don't necessarily need it to have a good character.
Yeah. And I mean, so it's one of my stats that I like. I agree with you, Doc, that everyone likes wisdom because they like seeing things.
Yeah.
My reasoning for wisdom is kind of close to what you said. I too like to see things, but I also like characters, frankly, that are a bit more street smart, that are a bit more, if you're an adventurer, to me, I feel like it's not a bad idea to be a little bit, you're wary of the world. You've walked through it. Unless your character isn't, unless your character hasn't been on the mean streets and has lived in an ivory tower. I often don't make those. If I'm making a fighter, if I'm making a paladin, if I'm making a druid, if I'm making a ranger, these are all classes to me that might be a little bit street smart. But on the meta point, they don't necessarily need wisdom, maybe warlock, but you get it. They don't necessarily need to have the high perception rolls. And again, my advice is always, wisdom is a good idea, especially when the game gets long.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned before, wisdom saving throws and checks are going to be attached to more and more spells. And especially if you're in, like, I don't know, a campaign where demon princes or things that break your brain show up.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing to have.
Right.
If you start looking around like, I think we're in the middle of a fucking H.P. Lovecraft story, you might want wisdom. I'm just not gonna lie. You might want it.
Yeah, that's true.
if you are a character, if you're a player that always yells about dark vision doesn't mean shit if your perception sucks. You
Right.
know, I
Right.
can see in the dark, not very far, because you suck at it.
Right.
I think being able to look around corners and kind of be a little shifty and scrappy and kind of know what's going to happen next just because you've lived long on this earth isn't a bad thing.
No.
I do think if you want to dump it, that's your prerogative. I do know some early players who have dumped wisdom in the past as like their first, outing in D&D, and I've kind of been taken about how much perception is leaned on.
Yeah.
I think DMs, I mean, it's almost like a starter role for a session where a
Mhm.
DM will go, make a perception check, and
Right.
you're like, okay, and you do that. And that's how a lot of games might even start off when it comes to roles.
Yeah.
So I can completely understand like early player frustration where they're like, I didn't want to be street smart. I dumped it and now I can't see.
Right.
And I don't like the fact that I'm the only party member that keeps getting the dropped on. Like
Yeah.
everyone's you can't see that ancient red dragon right behind you, and he's like, no, I can't. Not to me. And they're like, well, that sucks. He's
Right.
right behind you, and he turns around and he's like, oh my god. So I can kind of see that frustration, but I do agree with you. You are a hipster, so dump it. So I think the final thing here is, of course, charisma. I
Yeah.
would like to say flat out, besides bards and warlocks, while it's like intelligence that might be nice to have, and maybe some of you barbarians want, to be able to intimidate people.
Mhm.
You don't need it. You don't need to be, you don't need to be smooth. You don't need to be Jack Sparrow. You don't need to be the Joker. You don't have that. You don't need to be a silver tongue every time.
Mhm.
Most people aren't,
Yeah.
frankly. Most people aren't that charismatic. I'm sorry. Most people don't have that way of the world about them.
It kind of reminds me like in Fallout where like if you go and like you talk to a guy and you have crazy high charisma, right? You might be able to just like get all the enemies to stand down or like just convince the guy like, no, give me your gun. And it's like, oh, okay. But it's one of those things where it's like, unless if you're really creative with it, it can be okay. It's for me, it's not super great, but at the same time, I've also seen players really use charisma really well.
Sure,
But kind
I
of as
agree
you were
with
saying, it's like you don't necessarily need it if you're kind of like not really sure how to utilize it, or if you're not really thinking of creative ways that you can use charisma to get around encounters or other things like that. Don't necessarily need it. It'll be okay. You're not going to be a half-toothed, stinky, like
you. Right, you're gonna be a
anti-social.
person.
Yeah, like I mean,
You're
it's
not a comedian, you're a person.
right.
Like, and I think part of that though, just to kind of jump in briefly, is
Yeah.
that with charisma, unless it's high, honestly, you're not going to get the same results in some of the checks that you want,
Right.
right? You have a +1 or 2 to charisma, that's fine, but the big moneymaker, stand the army down, convince the guard to do a thing, intimidate a guy out of something, it's really going to boil down to a lot of those higher stats.
Yep.
And if you're a barbarian and you have like a 17 in charisma and you have to like dump one of your physical attributes a bit, I don't know how much that's going to, in the long run, help you.
Right.
So that's just my 2 cents. I say you don't need it. You can absolutely drop it. You're not going to be a bad person if you do. If you have a 10 in charisma, you are an average person who
Mhm.
has good jokes and some bad jokes. You're not going to be the prettiest. I mean, I'm still attached to charisma being attached to your looks, like
Right.
it was in older systems. I
Okay.
really like just like, oh, you're 10, you're plain looking. Oh,
Yep.
you're 15? You're kind of pretty. For some reason, I've always stuck with that, even though I've had DMs like scream at me, like, that's not their character. They're not ugly because they don't have a charisma. And I'm like, fine.
I,
Fine.
I think there's some real world implications with that too that aren't necessarily unbased. Like that's definitely like again, we're not a reality podcast, but like yeah, you're gonna have some natural charisma if you are pretty looking. And we can discuss that another time. But
You know, all those tens that listen to this podcast.
oh
Uh,
yes.
I mean, by the way, if you are listening to, actually, you know, I'm just going to give it out right now. If you listen to DumpStat, you will have a +2 to dating. You're going to be more interesting because of us. That's right. You're welcome. More charismatic. I'm just tossing it out there.
This is not
Next
a legal
time,
guarantee.
this is. But this is binding. Joe Rogan agrees with me. If you're going out on a date tonight and you're like, I don't know, I'm not too confident. Remember, you listen to DumpStat today. That's +2. That's +2. That's 24 hours of +2 dating goodness. You're welcome. From me to you, remind you, you are making a deal with a lich. That's not always a great idea, but +2.
Oh man.
I'm a good lich, maybe. When it comes to charisma, though, like a monk who's charismatic, like I had a friend of mine who made a monk who was very charismatic, and charisma was a very high stat for him. And it worked out great because he wanted to essentially be a Bruce Lee kind of really badass Hollywood kung fu type who would beat the shit out of you, but do the 80s line, you know, he'd break your arm or your hand and he'd be like, guess you're not holding that. I can't do it off the top of my head, but you know, like he'd shatter, you know, your pelvis, and you're like, that's okay. You know, he'd do a line, and there would be, you know, it would be fun, and he would also make like dramatic speeches to inspire people, and he was very bard-esque to the point where his next character he just made a bard.
Yeah.
Because he realized through playing this monk, he's like, I really like having high charisma, but I'd prefer having a character that's optimized to having high charisma, and a monk doesn't always give me that. Because he also had to take down, I think, his constitution and part of his wisdom. I can tell in the long run that kind of irked him, but I mean, you can absolutely have it. I want to make a cleric that is like a mega church preacher who has really high charisma.
Oh man.
People. That is definitely like next character idea.
And then like ask for donations of like unreasonable.
Yes. I mean, and that's one of the good things about charisma is if you're a party struggling for money, having a bard that can strum that loot and get some cash quick, that's not I can't tell you how many bards I've played with who's like, what's that? We're out of money. I'm going to the center of town, putting out my hat and putting on a performance. And everyone's like, okay, do that. And hopefully you can get some party funds because our barbarian needs a new axe that he's going to name Sweetness. You know, that needs to happen. You know, the druid needs a new pants made of wood. And for some reason he won't chop it. So let's pay a guy. Yeah. Like, there's just some things that charisma comes in handy, right? To make a beautiful podcast, you need charisma. But is it a dumb stat to me? Yeah, it is. You don't need it. It's kind of like I'd actually put it more as a dumb stat than intelligence.
Really? Interesting.
Only because even though I think there are more situations for charisma, they aren't too much of substance, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like the necessary roles needed to really convince someone to do something are usually a lot higher than
And by the way, if you're a barbarian and you don't have a high intimidate stat or what have you because you didn't put it into charisma, guess what? You can break a guy's leg and that'll give you advantage. You know, like there's just some things with charisma that I sit and I look at it and I'm like, in the long term, it either needs to be really high or it's a little bit pointless to attempt some of these. You could get lucky, of course, right? It's a numbers game. We are literally gambling in a fantasy world. But at the same point, you can't just say, well, I have a middling charisma stat. I bet you I could persuade everybody in this one cult to follow me as their new god. That's probably not going to happen.
No, it's not.
And by the way, if you're a player, please submit to me. I want to hear every time you've tried to convince people you're a god. That's one of my favorite player tropes, is to meet like a new tribe or go to a cult or something and be like, actually, it is I, your new god. And they put like dancing lights around him or something.
Yeah.
I had a DM, just side tangent. I had a DM. We tried to do that to this one, like, tribe of kobolds, and we did the dancing lights thing, and some kobold wizard did the dancing light thing back at us. We're like, oh no, the jig is up, gang. Us level 2s are gonna get out of here.
That's amazing. Oh man.
No, that was pretty good. But charisma to me is very dumpable. Yeah. And I think intelligence, if you have the right DM, will bear fruit. I think it's almost rarer, even though it might come up more in certain situations. Charisma is not going to save you as much as knowing that the demon lord lives in that castle over there.
It might be helpful for some saves, but it is helpful for some saves if you don't want to get like possessed immediately. But yeah, I think you're right, where it's going to be one of those things where it's not necessarily needed unless if you're a class that requires it.
Right. And by the way, I don't want to completely knowledge is power, reading rainbow, but it is good. Okay? Education's good. Fun fact today, Joe Rogan is here with us. That's a new fun fact. +2 to dating. That's another fun fact. But the funnest fact is that education is good. The earth is not flat. Shut up, Joe Rogan. And you need to read books. Go read. These are things that you should do in and out of your games. So
it's true.
Yeah. Just a little tip from me to you. Read a book. Wild. There's a lot of crazy stuff in there. Words, letters. It's insane. So with all of that, Doc, what is ultimately the DumpStat that you think? What is it?
Oh man. Why did you ask me this question? I don't want to be responsible for this.
Do it.
I can't say intelligence. I can't do it.
Say charisma together and hold hands.
I really don't want to. I'm going to say it. You should dump charisma.
Yes. Yes.
Well, right. You just blew up the microphone.
Yeah, that is right, Doc the human fighter. Join me.
The lich has convinced me.
I like this just because this podcast will just be the slow corruption of Doc. All right, everybody. Thank you all for listening. Next episode, I think we're just going to have to do clerics. All clerics you'll go. I want to talk about why I feel like it's a very underused and kind of shit on class to the point where there's a meme now of people going, we need a cleric. And you do need a cleric. You always need a cleric. Clerics are good. I am actually, after this episode, I am going to do a ton of cleric research. I might even jump into a game as a cleric just to really play as one, so that we both can bring to you our cleric facts. And watch next episode. I started off with going, clerics suck. I don't know why. Like right now, they're going like, yeah, man, we need clerics. And I don't even.
Well, I'll tell you, if you do play cleric, I will tell you probably will come into this next episode not saying that. So just be prepared.
That'd be funny though. It's just sit down and be like, hey, so how'd you do with your cleric experiments? Oh, they're the most pointless class. We need to get rid of them. Just give them paladins. I don't know. All right.
Well, we'll see.
Well, Doc, thank you guys. Thank you, Doc, for joining me today. I always appreciate it.
Hey, always my pleasure.
+2 to dating. We'll see you next week. We'll talk to you guys later. Goodbye.
Goodbye. You've just been listening to DumpStat, a podcast presented by Horizon Kingdoms. Horizon Kingdoms is a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition server that's free to play. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and join up on Discord to join in on a new adventure. For more DumpStat, be sure to find us on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe.